What if even the ashes could pray? What if that which was destroyed still had a voice before God? How many times do we look at what's left and believe it's over? That the fire consumed everything, that the dust is the end. But what if the dust could speak? What if the ashes held memories? What if, before the Creator, even what was burned still had a hidden purpose? There are secrets buried beneath the silence of destruction. Remains of temples, bodies, dreams, all reduced to dust, but still pulsing at a frequency that only heaven hears. The ashes speak, and God answers, not with human words, but with eternal echoes. What the world calls the end, the Almighty calls testimony. Each particle carries a name, a story, a memory. The ashes are not merely what remains, they are what withstood the fire, what survived the pain, what still bows before the throne. We live surrounded by ruins, pretending not to hear their voices. But the dust speaks, of forgotten wars, broken promises, lives extinguished by human indifference. And while humanity sweeps away its ashes like trash, heaven gathers each grain as a prayer. What was burned is not lost. What the world discarded, God kept. Because in the eternal kingdom, nothing is silent, not even what has already been destroyed. Ashes speak to God when man is silent. They whisper what the heart did not dare to confess. They speak of unspoken repentance, of forgiveness asked too late, of faith that survived amidst pain. They tell the stark truth that the fire revealed, that love and judgment walk hand in hand, that fire, before destroying, purifies, that what collapses before human eyes may be being rebuilt before the divine gaze. And if the ashes speak, it is because God's silence was never absence, it was listening. The world ignored this revelation because it fears what it does not understand. It fears the idea that everything it did, said, and was remains alive in some way, that every word cast to the wind, every act hidden in the dark, leaves spiritual traces that will never fade. The ashes are the memory of divine justice. They are the invisible testimony that time does not deceive the eternal, and perhaps that is why God speaks through fire. Because fire does not lie. It reveals. It shows what is true, what endures, what shines even after being burned. The ashes do not lie about who we were. They do not hide what we did. They simply present themselves before God, pure, sincere, stripped of masks, and God hears them. Perhaps the greatest revelation ignored by the world is this, that even what has burned still has a voice before the throne, that nothing is forgotten, that even dust has a purpose, and that each flame that consumed what we were ignited what we can still become. So the question is, what would your ashes say today if they could speak to God? Would they ask for forgiveness? Would they praise? Would they mourn what was lost? Or would they give thanks for what the fire revealed? This is the mystery the world chose not to hear. But today, in this video, the veil is lifted. The ashes will speak, and perhaps as you listen, you will discover that the fire also spoke to you. Before we move on to what comes next, I want you to pause, breathe, reflect on what you've just heard, because this video isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognized the truth behind the words. The ashes speak to God, but they also speak to us. And each one who hears this message carries a flame, the flame of understanding what the world has chosen to ignore. Therefore, before we proceed with the full revelation, I want to ask you something simple but essential. Leave your comment down here. I want to know what these words have awakened in you. What has the fire already consumed in your life? What still remains standing? Each comment here is like a spark. When you share what you felt, it's not just the algorithm that reacts. The content itself gains spiritual power, reaching others who need to hear the same call. Then like this video. Now, this simple gesture shows that the message still matters. that the truth, however profound, still finds hearts willing to hear it. And if you feel that there is something bigger about to be revealed, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, not just to be notified, but to be a part of this journey. Because what comes next is more than an explanation, it's a revelation. The fire will speak again, and this time no one will be able to pretend they didn't hear. The world was silent, a dense, almost palpable silence, as if time itself had stopped to observe what remained. Ashes covered the earth like a sacred, cold and heavy mantle. The wind, once full of voices and prayers, now only carried the dust of those who once dreamed of eternity. The cities which once shone under the sun were on their knees. The ruined temples seemed to whisper ancient promises, begging heaven for an answer that never came. And the sky remained motionless, like a broken mirror reflecting the agony of man. Everything sacred seemed to have been forgotten. The squares, where hope was once spoken of, had become deserted. The houses, which once held laughter, now sheltered only echoes. The whole world seemed to breathe guilt. And yet there was something alive among the ashes, something the fire could not destroy. An invisible presence, a murmur that pierced the silence, as if God himself was still there, waiting for someone to call him by name. The ashes, cold and still, were not merely remains, they were witnesses. Each particle told a story. Stories of abandoned faith, of burned love, of broken promises. It was as if the ground whispered, "We saw everything." And that everything was too heavy for the human heart to bear, because ashes do not lie, they do not distort, they do not hide. They only show what the fire revealed and what man pretended not to see. Have you ever felt this, the feeling of looking around and realizing that something sacred has been lost? As if the world's faith has been slowly consumed without anyone noticing? That is the weight of the ashes, not the weight of destruction, but the weight of remembrance. Because fire can extinguish everything except the truth, and in the ashes, the truth still speaks. The silenced voices of humanity echo in this silence. Men and women who lived believing in themselves, building empires, accumulating wealth, forgetting that everything that rises without the breath of God is condemned to turn to dust. Now, dust covers the statues and monuments. Human glory has become a memory, and the memory has turned to ashes. But there is something strange in the ruins, a faint glow, a light that refuses to go out, because even where everything seems dead, the spirit still moves. It hovers over the void, as in the beginning of creation, waiting for the right moment to speak again. And when the spirit speaks, even the ashes respond. Some look at this scene and see only destruction, but those with spiritual eyes see something more, the fertile field of restoration. God never starts from above, he starts from the dust. He speaks in the desert, works in silence, and rebuilds from the ashes. Everything the world has called the end is the ground where he plants the new. But the world ignores. The rush, the pride, the constant noise prevent people from realizing they are treading on sacred ground. The ashes beneath our feet are not just dust. They are testimonies of broken promises and forgotten faith. How many times have you gone through something that seemed like the absolute end, and yet something inside you said it wasn't the end yet? That voice is the echo of the ashes. It is God's call speaking through what remains. And perhaps this is the revelation the world has ignored, that God never spoke only through life, but also through death, that he manifests himself in both light and shadow, that he hears the cry of destruction and transforms what was dust into prophecy, because ashes have a voice, and that voice carries the wisdom the world has lost. While man laments what he has lost, heaven observes what remains. And what remains is always enough to begin again. It was so in the beginning, when all was empty and God said, "Let there be light." It is so now when all seems ruined and the Spirit whispers, "There is still hope." But to hear that voice, one must silence the noise of the world. One must look at what remains, not at what is gone. Modern man has forgotten to listen. He lives with eyes full, but a soul empty. He seeks answers on screens, but ignores the signs on the ground. The ashes have been speaking for a long time, but no one wants to listen, because listening to the ashes is facing one's own reflection. It is realizing how far we have strayed from our essence. Look around you. Everything the fire touched still exists in the form of ashes, and each ash is a testament. Where there was fire, there was presence. Where there was loss, there is remembrance. And where there is remembrance, there is the possibility of redemption. God does not forget what man destroys. He preserves, he transforms, he restores. Perhaps that's why ruins have something beautiful about them, because even in collapse there is a disguised promise. Even in what the world calls failure, there are traces of eternity. The ashes speak to God because they have been touched by fire, and everything that fire touches becomes sacred. And it is in this setting of ruins, silence, and dust that the story continues. Because God's silence is not absence, it is expectation. Expectation of the moment when humanity will finally hear again. The ashes speak, the sky listens, and the cycle begins anew. If you felt something different so far, something that made you reflect, I want you to tell me in the comments what the fire has already consumed in your life and what faith remains amidst the ashes. Write the phrase, "The ashes speak to me." If this message touched something within you, I want to see who is truly listening, because what comes next will burn even deeper. Ashes move, slowly, as if breathing. There is a sound that comes neither from the wind nor from the earth, but from the silence itself. John, in his vision, feels the weight of the burned world before him. Temples reduced to dust, faces erased by time, prayers that were never uttered. But among the ruins, something pulsates. A voice, almost imperceptible, as if the dust itself whispered to the eternal. It was the memory of what was, crying out to be heard. It was the voice of the ashes, which before God still had something to say. He approaches, each step echoes on the ground of ash and remembrance. And suddenly he understands. Nothing touched by the presence of God can be completely destroyed. Because even what burned, even what turned to dust, still carries within itself the memory of the light. The ashes speak. They do not ask for pity, they reveal. They bear witness. They tell what the world has forgotten, that creation does not end in destruction, and that the fire of God is not only what consumes, but what purifies. John tries to understand what he hears. It is an ancient spiritual language, impossible to translate into human words. They are voices murmuring stories of faith, of fall, of repentance. Voices of nations that rose up against the Most High and now reduced to dust, still worship him. Voices of men and women who lost everything but did not lose their connection with the Creator. There is pain, there is lament, but there is something deeper. There is worship among the ashes, a praise that does not depend on glory or form, a song made of ruin and hope. What if what you lost could still speak to God? What if that phase that burned away, that love that's gone, that dream that crumbled, still had a voice before the throne? John realizes that the fire that destroys also reveals. That God hears even what the world considers dead, that nothing is so forgotten that it cannot be remembered by him, and it is at that moment that the revelation strikes him like lightning. The ashes are not the end. They are the testimony that there was a presence, that something was real, that the flame existed, and God speaks to what remains. The apostle feels the ground vibrate beneath his feet. The ruins seem to breathe. And the vision expands. He sees entire cities reduced to dust, but from the ashes emerge figures of light, echoes of faith, ancient prayers rising like smoke. He understands that the Spirit dwells not only in what is alive, but also in what has been burned and purified, that there is glory in what the world has called defeat, because what is surrendered to the divine fire is not destroyed, it is transformed. And perhaps that's the part the world didn't want to hear. That God's judgment is not annihilation, but dialogue. That fire is not vengeance, but language. The ashes are the testimony of love that doesn't give up, of a presence that doesn't abandon, of faith that overcomes the impossible. John understands that God speaks not only to the saints, but also to the remnants, to the broken, to those whom the world has swept into oblivion. The Creator bends down to the dust and answers. And perhaps that's what we still need to understand. There are burnt voices that continue to echo. There are lives that the world called the end, but which, before God, are still in process. Because the Spirit does not silence what has been destroyed. He translates, and everything that has passed through the fire, however fragmented it may be, still holds the spark of eternity. João feels tears streaming down his face. They are not tears of fear, but of reverence. He understands that even suffering speaks, that even silence is prayer, that God hears the dust because he himself became dust to redeem the dust. And suddenly the whisper of the ashes transforms into a chorus, weak but infinite, a song that fills the void, that restores meaning. It is as if the entire universe were breathing again. Now imagine this. What if everything that burned in your life was still speaking to God at this very moment? What if the ashes of your mistakes, your losses, your pain, were still calling your name before the Creator? Nothing is lost in God's eyes, nothing. What the fire touched, he purifies. What time took away, he remembers. What the world forgot, he hears. And perhaps the ashes you carry are precisely the altar from which he wants to speak again. So before we continue, take a breath. Look at what's left. The ashes are still there, and perhaps it is through them that God will answer. If this message touched you in any way, I want you to comment below. The ashes still speak. I want to read everyone who understood what is being revealed here. Leave a like, subscribe, because what comes next will show you what the whole world has ignored, the true power of ashes before God. John remains motionless before the invisible. The sound of ashes mingles with the pulse of the universe. He doesn't understand how there can be voice where there is only silence, nor presence where everything seems lost. But something begins to reveal itself within him, a mystery that surpasses human reason, the divine paradox. How can what has been reduced to nothing be remembered by the eternal? How can something consumed by fire still exist before God? The human mind says, it's over, but the Spirit answers, it still lives. This is the contradiction that human eyes cannot bear, because the world measures the value of things by what remains visible. God, however, measures it by what still vibrates in eternity. John understands that forgetfulness does not exist for the Creator. Each fragment, each dust, each ash holds a story, an echo of light, a living memory in the divine heart. Nothing is lost, nothing. Time has no power over God's memory. And what man calls the end is merely a point of passage, the moment when the eternal gathers what the fire has purified and transforms it into testimony. The human mind is confused. But Lord, what was burned, what was destroyed, what turned to dust, how can you have a voice? And the answer comes like a gentle thunderclap. Because I am the God who calls into existence what is not, as if it already were. The paradox is this: nothing speaks to the all. Silence carries the word. Destruction becomes raw material for revelation. God does not forget what the world buries. He visits the forgotten, awakens the dead, and transforms dust into prophecy. John feels the weight of this wisdom. He sees, in a vision, a sea of ashes, and perceives that in each particle there is a divine memory. The face of a righteous person, the cry of a repentant one, the tear of someone who prayed and was not heard by men, but was kept by God. Each ash is a sacred record, a fragment of eternity that the earth no longer recognizes. And there, in the midst of this incandescent void, the apostle understands something that the whole world has ignored. God's judgment is not forgetfulness, it is remembrance. Divine memory is absolute. It does not judge based on the present but on the whole. It does not see ruin, it sees process. John sees before the throne a flame that burns without consuming, and this flame touches the ashes, revealing invisible colors within them. It is as if each fragment shines anew. What was burned now gleams with the divine presence. It is at this moment that the paradox becomes evident. What the world calls loss, God calls purification. What time calls oblivion, God calls eternity. And perhaps that's what many don't understand, that the God of justice is the same God of remembrance, that he doesn't erase history, he illuminates it. The flame doesn't come to destroy, it comes to reveal what was hidden. The fire of divine presence is not punishment, it is purification. It is the gaze that penetrates the abyss and finds meaning even in what seemed dead. John feels this as a sweet weight. He understands that true condemnation is not fire but oblivion. And since God never forgets, judgment is, in fact, an act of love. The paradox deepens. How can love judge? How can fire heal? John realizes that God's love is so pure that it cannot coexist with falsehood, and the fire, being an expression of this love, does not come to punish, but to reveal what is true. What withstands the fire is eternal. What crumbles was never real. That is why the ashes speak, because they are the testimony of what was true, of what endured the touch of ardent love. Think about it. Maybe what you lost wasn't the end, but the process. Maybe the fire that burned something inside you was the same fire God used to remind you who you were. Maybe those ruins in your life aren't signs of abandonment, but traces of a divine encounter. Because the Eternal One doesn't erase, he transforms. He looks at the ashes and says, "I still see." John hears that voice, and it is like thunder within his heart. God speaks to the dust. He speaks to the memory of what was. And in this sacred dialogue, the impossible happens. What was reduced to nothingness comes back to life before him. And this is the true resurrection, when that which the world decreed as forgotten rises up in the gaze of God. What if everything you think you've lost is still alive in God's memory? What if the ashes of your history are still being visited by him now? No tear is lost, no prayer dies, no gesture of love is forgotten. All that is real remains before him. This is the paradox. Time erases, God revives. Man forgets, God remembers. Fire consumes, the Spirit rebuilds. John falls to his knees. Revelation overwhelms him. He realizes that even nothingness has a function in the divine plan. That chaos is the stage where love shows its strength. That destruction is only the beginning of a deeper recreation. Ashes are the language of eternity. Dust is the alphabet of redemption. The eternal writes with what the world has discarded. And that is too powerful to be ignored. Because in the end, what God seeks is not the perfection of man, but the truth that remains after the fire. What remains in the ashes is what truly matters. It is what survived the test. And when the Creator looks at the dust, he doesn't see what is lost. He sees what endured. Now, before we continue with the next part of this revelation, I want to challenge you. What do you think God still remembers about you? What part of your story, which the world has forgotten, do you believe still speaks to him? Write in the comments. I want to see who understood the depth of this mystery. Write, God still remembers me. This is more than a phrase. It's a testimony. Because if he remembered the dust, he certainly hasn't forgotten you. The silence of the sky is broken. John, still on his knees, hears the voice that cuts through time and wounds the soul with truth. Nothing that has been burned remains unknown. The phrase does not come from outside, but from within, as if eternity spoke through human conscience itself. It is a decree, a reminder that fire was never a punishment, but a language. Fire speaks. Fire translates what words cannot. And before this revelation, John understands that God's judgment is not a tribunal. It is a dialogue in flames. Fire is the grammar of the divine. It consumes the superfluous, translates the invisible, illuminates what was hidden in the ashes of the soul. Nothing that fire touches goes unseen, because the touch of fire is the gaze of God. When he burns, it is not to destroy, but to reveal. Fire reveals intentions, thoughts, secrets. It is the light that does not lie. And that is why judgment is not only future, it is now. It happens every time the fire of truth passes over something and transforms it. John sees. The ashes move. They seem to respond to the voice. It's as if the dust gains consciousness in the presence of the divine. And the Spirit whispers, I have never stopped hearing what has been silenced. Every life, every tear, every mistake, every repentance, all is recorded in the fire. Because the fire is the testimony of divine justice. And justice in God is not vengeance, it is remembrance. He does not punish to destroy, he purifies to reveal what is worthy to remain. John's visions intensify. He sees multitudes like living flames, burning but not being consumed. He sees faces the world has forgotten, names history has erased, and all of them shine in the heart of the eternal fire. God speaks to the ashes as one converses with sleeping children. It is love in its most severe and, at the same time, most compassionate form. Love that does not tolerate lies. Love that does not pretend not to see. Love that kindles judgment not out of hatred, but out of fidelity to the truth. The apostle realizes that the fire of judgment and the fire of the Spirit are the same. The same heat that illuminates the saint is what consumes falsehood. The same brilliance that reveals gold is what melts the dross. Fire is justice and mercy at the same time. It destroys what is shadow and exalts what is light. And John weeps, not from fear, but from reverence, because he understands that the fire that judged Sodom is the same that ignited the bush before Moses, the same that descended upon the disciples at Pentecost, the same flame, the same God. Nothing was lost, nothing escaped. God leaves nothing in oblivion. Nothing that has been burned ceases to be known. This sentence echoes in every layer of existence. The entire universe vibrates with this principle. Because fire is consciousness. It penetrates where matter cannot reach. And each particle of ash is a memory before God. Judgment is this, the living memory of everything that has passed through the fire and remained true. John sees the burned cities of the past and realizes that even the ruins have a voice. The stones cry out. The ashes sing. They do not ask for pity. They testify. They say what lips did not dare to say. God hears what man has silenced. He gathers the echo of injustice and transforms it into testimony. And John understands what few have understood. God's judgment does not come to condemn the world, but to make it speak the truth. That is why fire appears before restoration, because nothing impure can enter the presence of the eternal. Fire prepares, it cleanses, it restores form to what has been deformed. What passes through the fire and resists lives forever. What does not resist was never real. Fire is the criterion. It separates what is eternal from what is ephemeral. But there is something deeper in all of this. John realizes that God is not distant, observing the fire. He is within it. God himself reveals himself in the flame. He is the fire that speaks with the ashes. He is the heat that gives voice to the dust. And judgment is not the eternal punishing man, it is the eternal revealing man to himself. It is the moment when everything that was hidden comes to light, not to humiliate, but to liberate. Judgment is love in its most ardent form. It is the moment when the Creator returns to the being, the reflection it has lost. It is when God looks and says, "I purified you in the fire because I loved you too much to let you lie about who you were." And this is the greatest fear and the greatest grace, to be seen by God in total transparency, to be known without veils, and to realize that even so he chooses to call you by name. John, overcome by this revelation, feels that fire is not merely an element, but a presence. He perceives that judgment is the manifestation of divine truth over the falsehood of time. Fire does not destroy what is pure, it makes it shine. What man fears as punishment is, in truth, the deepest touch of love. For God does not burn to extinguish, he burns to remind. Ashes are the result of a conversation between God and matter. They are what remains when the Spirit finishes speaking. They carry memory, meaning, and purpose. Each ash is a reminder that the fire has passed, but the truth remains. Judgment does not extinguish life, it redefines it. And perhaps this is the revelation that the world has ignored. Fire is the language of mercy. It does not speak to condemn, but to correct. It does not come to eliminate man, but to purify him until only what is true remains. That is why God says, "Nothing that has been burned ceases to be known." Nay, because he knows what has been tested, and what has been tested has a name, has a history, has eternity. Think about this for a moment. How many things in your life have been through fire? How many times have you thought God was punishing you, when in reality he was revealing something to you? How many times have you seen something crumble and not realized that in the ashes he was teaching you the truth about yourself? Nothing is lost. Nothing. The fire of judgment is the mirror of love. It shows what is real. It doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to set you free. And that's why many fear judgment, because few can bear to see the reflection without masks. The fire shows what we are, but it also shows what we can still become. Now, if you're understanding the depth of this, if this word is burning inside you, comment below. Fire speaks. I want to see who's been following along this far, who feels that God's fire is not punishment, but presence. Write this phrase in the comments. The fire speaks, and may each of your words echo like a flame before the eternal, because sometimes it is in the ashes that God speaks to us most. John raises his eyes and sees the impossible. From the ashes, something begins to move. They are not bodies nor shadows, but echoes. Echoes of stories the world deemed closed, voices that had fallen silent before their time. He sees them slowly emerging from the dust, as if oblivion itself were incapable of imprisoning what God chose to remember. They are souls that resurface not in physical form, but as living memories, consciousnesses that still have something to say. They rise from the silence of the dust and walk towards the light, not just any light, but the light that reveals the true face of eternity. The scene is of impossibly beautiful beauty. The dust rises, and with it, the past. Kings, prophets, slaves, mothers, children, all in a single movement of return. It is not a resurrection of flesh, but a resurrection of meaning. What was forgotten by history is remembered by the Spirit. The words that no one heard, the tears that no one saw, the pains that no one understood, all now rise as testimony. John understands. Before God, even what has been erased still cries out for redemption. Nothing dies completely. Everything that once existed continues to vibrate in the divine memory. These souls do not return to ask for human justice. They return to fulfill a cycle. They are fragments of interrupted lives, stories that did not reach their end, promises broken by time. And now, before the throne, they are called by name. One by one, like notes of an unfinished symphony, they sound again. John realizes that judgment is this, the moment when all stories are retold until the end. What seemed lost gains a voice. What seemed destroyed gains meaning. It is time being stitched together again by the hand of God. The apostle tries to look away, but cannot. Each soul shines with a different intensity, as if each one revealed an aspect of divine glory. There are souls that burn in peace, others that tremble before the light. But all are before the same fire that does not consume, only reveals. John feels he is seeing the map of eternity, a tapestry of existences intertwined by grace and justice. He realizes that judgment is not an isolated act, but a cosmic restoration. What was broken in Eden begins to be restored there, among the ashes. And it is then that he understands what the whole world ignored. Nothing is irrelevant. Every gesture, every word, every choice forms a flame before God. Human time tries to extinguish it, but divine time remembers. The ashes hold the truth of what we were. The fire only removes what is false. Souls rise again to be remembered, not condemned. Judgment is living memory. It is eternity saying, all that was real remains. John hears a song. It doesn't come from angels nor from men. It comes from the ashes themselves. It is the sound of lives being retold. Each echo is a confession, a cry, a plea transformed into adoration. It's as if the history of humanity is being narrated again, but now without masks, without pride, without distortions. The fire purified the lie, and what remains is pure testimony. Souls speak, and the universe listens. God observes. His voice is not one of condemnation, but of remembrance. He says, I do not forget what you called the end, because I was there, in every flame, in every ruin, in every silence. John understands. The fire that destroys is the same that resurrects. The same heat that consumes is what brings life. Souls are reborn because they were seen, because they were remembered, because God leaves nothing unfinished. Destruction before the eternal is only the interval before restoration. The apostle feels a mixture of fear and fascination. He realizes that the souls do not return to relive the past, but to complete what was left unfinished. Each one carries within them a story interrupted by pain, sin, and injustice. Now before the divine presence, everything is reconciled, the truth resurfaces, evil is exposed, love is revealed. And John understands that judgment is the most perfect form of redemption. What was burned is purified, what was forgotten is remembered, what was shattered is restored. The ashes begin to form figures of light. They are memories taking shape, destinies being rewritten. John sees that even what the world has destroyed continues to have a purpose. Because in the kingdom of God, the end is never the end. Every loss becomes part of the greater plan. Every pain becomes a word in an eternal story. Even what was silenced speaks again. And that is where the mystery deepens. Judgment is not the final punishment, it is the ultimate reconciliation. John feels the wind of souls passing through him. There is no suffering, only understanding. Each one seems to merge with the light, as if absorbed by glory itself. And the apostle understands that judgment is the moment when the Creator gathers back everything that has been fragmented. Each life is a flame returned to eternity. It is the return of ashes to the fire that gave them origin. But something surprises him. Some souls burn more intensely, as if they were still being purified, and God whispers, "These are the ones who loved, but did not understand. They were faithful, but they were lost. The fire will teach them what time could not." John then sees that the fire is not punishment, it is education. It is love in its most demanding form, teaching until the very end. He finally understands that the ashes are divine memory. They do not represent loss, but remembrance. They are proof that God does not forget what man wanted to erase. Judgment is the restoration of meaning. What seemed a fragment becomes whole again. What seemed an error reveals itself as part of the construction. God does not abandon what he created. He begins again from the dust. Joan tries to speak, but he can't. His voice catches in his throat, his soul bends. He stands before the ultimate truth. Nothing is truly dead as long as God remembers it. The dust still speaks, the ashes still pray, what time destroyed is still restored by eternity. And this is what the world has ignored, that the end of matter is not the end of history, that the silence of the ruins is merely the prelude to redemption. Now think about it. How many things in your life have you thought were destroyed forever? How many times have you looked at the ashes of something you loved and said, "It's over"? Perhaps you were mistaken. Because if God doesn't forget the dust, he doesn't forget you either. If he makes the ashes speak, imagine what he can do with your story, with your losses, with your new beginnings. God doesn't extinguish what has burned. He transforms, he remembers, he restores meaning. And perhaps this video is your call to remember what seemed dead. So comment below, "Nothing is forgotten." Write this sentence as a declaration of faith. I want to see who understands that even ashes rise again before God, because the fire passes, but love, eternal love, never fades. John observes the dust floating before him, moving as if it had a will of its own, as if each grain carried an ancient consciousness. He realizes that this dust is not merely matter, it is memory. Each particle carries within it a recollection of creation, a spark of the first breath that gave form to humankind. The dust speaks. It tells stories that time has tried to erase, but that eternity insists on preserving. John understands. The dust is the book that God never allowed to be burned. It holds everything, from the first day to the last breath. The dust of the earth is not dirt. It is a witness. It was there in the beginning, when God molded man from clay and breathed life into his nostrils, and it will be there in the end, when each body returns to the earth from whence it came. Between these two extremes, birth and return, the dust becomes the guardian of what we were. Every step, every tear, every act is imprinted on it. And John begins to perceive something both frightening and beautiful. Nothing is lost in the dust. The earth knows everyone's name. He touches the ground and feels as if he is touching eternity. The particles move, and he sees in them reflections of entire lives. The dust that once formed Adam also witnessed the blood of Abel. The same dust that saw the firstborn saw the first die. It carries both the miracle and the fall, both the beginning and the judgment. And that is why God said, "From dust you came, and to dust you shall return," not as punishment, but as a reminder. A reminder that all that we are comes from him, and all that we will be will return to him. Dust is not the end, it is the point of return. It is the link between creation and restoration. John realizes that each particle, as it rises in the visions of Revelation, represents not only resurrected bodies, but memories being awakened. God not only brings back what has died, he awakens what has been forgotten. Dust is the fabric of time. What seems disorder to man is a record to God. Each grain is a sacred archive of existence, As John contemplates, the wind begins to blow. The dust rises in luminous spirals as if answering an invisible call, and it is at that moment that he hears a voice, deep, ancient, indescribable, saying, "Nothing I have created will be lost." John understands the dust is not a symbol of death but of promise, a promise of return, a promise of continuity. The same dust that today covers tombs will tomorrow serve as soil for new creation. And that's where the mystery is revealed. Dust is not static. It moves, mixes, transforms. The dust of a king can mingle with the dust of a servant. The dust of a righteous person can rest beside the dust of a sinner. And yet, God distinguishes each one. He knows the origin of every particle. Nothing is confused before him. Dust is the testament to divine balance, where everything is equal in matter, but different in purpose. John realizes that God writes his justice even on the ground we walk on. He remembers the ancient words, "The earth cries out for the spilled blood," and now he understands why. The dust does not forget what it has seen. It holds the sound of silenced voices, unfulfilled promises, unheard cries. It is the archive of human pain, but also of divine hope. Because the same dust that cries today will be the same that one day will sing. It speaks the language of eternity, a language made of memories and light. João feels the ground beneath his feet pulsating as if it were alive. He realizes that the dust is a bridge between worlds, between the visible and the invisible, between time and eternity. Everything that has been and everything that will be is there, mixed together, awaiting the Creator's command. It is then that he understands the true meaning of the phrase that so many repeat without understanding. From dust we came, to dust we shall return. It is not a sentence, it is a cycle. It is grace in the form of matter. The dust of the earth is not the end of the flesh. It is the beginning of the spirit. When the body disintegrates, it merely returns to creation what was its own. And God gathers the invisible, the essence, the breath, the spirit, and keeps it until the day of restoration. John sees that dust is the purest symbol of divine faithfulness. Man forgets what he has lived, but dust does not. It preserves everything until heaven says, "Now." And when that "now" resounds, the dust will respond. Each particle will reunite with what belongs to it. Bodies will rise not only from beneath the earth, but from the memories of God. The dust will be the stage for the resurrection. John understands that God's power lies in transforming what seems useless into eternal witness. The dust is humble, but it is in it that the Creator writes the greatest secrets. As he watches, he sees a symbolic scene. The wind stirs up the dust in a spiral, and for a moment he sees faces, fragments of life, laughter and tears floating. Everything mixes together and then settles back down. João understands. Creation is not lost, it merely sleeps. The dust is the sleep of matter before awakening. Now imagine this. How many things in your life have you called dust? How many dreams have you watched crumble in your hands, thinking they had no more value? Perhaps you were mistaken, because for God, even what has become dust still has a destiny. Every failure, every loss, every ruin has a hidden purpose. Nothing is lost. Everything is prepared. Perhaps that relationship that collapsed didn't die. It returned to dust, to be recreated in another form. Perhaps that closed door wasn't the end. It was the cycle returning to its origin so that you could be remade from scratch. From dust we came, and to dust we return. Not as punishment, but as a new beginning. Dust is the school of eternity, where God teaches us that nothing is in vain. Think about it. Even Christ's body passed through the earth before ascending to heaven. Even he mingled with human dust to prove that matter can be sacred. That changes everything. The ground you walk on is not ordinary. It is a witness to eternity. It is the same soil that saw the tears of prophets, the footsteps of the righteous, the falls of kings. And it remains there, faithful, silent, awaiting the day when the Creator will say, "Arise." Dust is humanity's oldest altar. Everything we are ends in it, and everything God does begins from it. It is the point where time touches infinity. John understands that even what man calls destruction, God calls preparation. And perhaps that is what we need to remember today. Dust is not the end. It is the return to the beginning. What has been broken will be remade. What has been lost will be restored. What the fire has burned will be purified. The dust is the promise hidden in the ground. And when eternity blows again, every particle will know what to do, because the dust has obeyed God since the first day. Now I want to give you a challenge. Write in the comments, "The dust speaks." If you understood this message, also write down what in your life needs to be restored, what needs to be remembered, what needs to rise from the dust. Because perhaps at this very moment God is simply preparing you to start over from scratch. And zero in divine language is never absence, it is origin. The modern world erects skyscrapers but forgets altars. It builds flying machines but no longer knows how to bend the knee. It lives connected to everything but disconnected from God. And while cities shine with artificial lights, the sky remains silent. John observes in his vision humanity that has forgotten the sacred, men and women who call progress what is in fact alienation, and the ashes of history, silent, continue to bear witness to what the world has tried to erase. The ashes speak. They speak of temples torn down, of forgotten promises, of generations that traded presence for haste, prayer for distraction, faith for logic. Each ash is a fragment of what was once consecrated, and today lies covered by the dust of oblivion. John understands that there is nothing more tragic than a world that has lost the memory of God, because when the sacred is forgotten, man begins to worship himself, and that is where true ruin begins. We live in an era where everything is instantaneous, but nothing is eternal. People rush, produce, talk, opine, but few stop to listen to the sound of ashes. Few remember that there is an invisible dimension sustaining everything that exists. Modern man thinks he dominates time, but time is what swallows him. He considers himself immortal, while his days vanish like smoke. John sees, in his vision, crowds lighting screens as if they were candles, worshipping digital images that promise glory and pleasure, but deliver only emptiness. And in this void, the ashes begin to speak again. They whisper what the world doesn't want to hear, that every civilization that forgets the sacred ends in ruins, that no human throne can endure when the altar is abandoned. The dust of ancient cities still holds the echo of voices that mock the eternal, and each one has been silenced by the passage of time. Babylon, Rome, empires, nations, all were great until the day they thought they could be greater than God. Modern man doesn't burn incense to idols of stone, but worships others made of metal, glass, and algorithms. He doesn't erect temples, but builds brands, companies, and ideologies. And without realizing it, he has replaced worship with consumption, reverence with opinion, eternity with trends. John understands that the new temple of the world is the human mind itself, and in it the altar is empty. The fire of faith has gone out in many hearts, and the ashes of that lost flame now float in the air, revealing spiritual forgetfulness. God, however, is never silent. He speaks even through silence. And in the ashes of our time, he leaves signs, tragedies, crises, disasters, not as punishment, but as a call. They are the Creator's calls to a world that has strayed too far. Each collapse is a reminder, "You have forgotten me." John sees this and understands that God's judgment is not only what will come at the end of time, but what is already manifesting now. when humanity reaps the fruit of its own pride. But what is most impressive is that even among the modern ruins, there are still remnants of faith. There are still hearts that hear the whisper of the ashes, people who feel that something is wrong, that the soul was not made to live chasing after nothing. These people are like embers hidden beneath the dust, waiting for the divine breath to rekindle them. John realizes that it is because of them that God still waits, still postpones the end, still gives a chance for repentance. And perhaps you, who are listening to me now, are one of those embers. Perhaps you feel something calling you, a restlessness that won't go away, an emptiness that nothing can fill. This feeling is not weakness. It's a sign that the sacred still speaks within you. The ashes of your faith may seem cold, but God knows how to rekindle even what man considers dead. The modern world no longer believes in miracles, yet lives surrounded by them. Each sunrise is a reminder that the sun still rises on the just and the unjust. Each breath is proof that God still sustains creation. But man does not see because he is distracted. He seeks meaning in data, statistics, and likes, while the true mystery pulsates in simple things, the wind, the earth, the dust. João understands that man has become blind to the invisible. He walks on sacred ashes without realizing that he is treading on the history of his own soul. The ashes of modernity are different. They come not only from fire, but from indifference. It is the dust accumulated upon forgotten faith. It is the spiritual dust of those who live as if God were a myth. And that is why the revelation of the ashes is so necessary now, because they remind us that the eternal continues to watch, and that nothing that is holy disappears. It only awaits the right time to be revealed again. John sees humanity as a body that breathes, but whose soul is asleep. He sees churches full, but hearts empty. People repeating sacred words without feeling their weight. Spirituality has become spectacle. Worship has become performance. The world displays piety but fears silence, and it is in silence that God speaks loudest. The ashes cry out, "Remember," but few listen. And it is then that the prophet understands. The ashes are not only a reminder of what was, but a warning of what is to come. Every time man extinguishes the sacred, he draws closer to judgment. The fire that destroys is the same that purifies, and what is not purified will be consumed. God's love is not passive. It is a fire that reveals what is hidden. And one day all the ashes will be raised before him, and each one will tell what it witnessed. Modern man calls it myth, outdated religion, ancient poetry, but time always proves who is right. Science ages, theories change, human truths contradict each other, but the words of God remain the same. And the ashes, the same ashes that covered Sodom, Jerusalem, empires and kingdoms, continue to say, "Nothing escapes the memory of the eternal." Perhaps today the world seems strong, invincible, self-sufficient. But remember, dust is patient. It waits. It has seen kings fall, civilizations rise and vanish, and it will still be here when buildings crumble and screens go dark. The dust of the earth is the clock of eternity. It marks God's time, not man's. The call of ashes is not meant to frighten you, but to awaken you. It is to remind you that there is still time to rebuild the altar, rekindle the flame, and remember the sacredness that dwells within you. Because the worst ruin is not that of stone, it is that of a heart that has forgotten to worship. And now I want you to comment below. I heard the ashes. This phrase is a sign of someone who has awakened. If this message made you reflect, also write what the modern world has most forgotten, in your opinion. This is important. I read every comment and want to see who can still hear God's silent call amidst the noise of this century. From ashes, light is born. It has always been so. What seemed lost, destroyed, extinguished forever, God transforms into seed. John contemplates what the modern world has forgotten, that the end is never truly the end. It is merely the disguise of the beginning. The dust that covers the earth, the same dust that hides the ruins and remains of all that once was, is also the cradle of recreation, because God writes the future with what men call the past. And when everything seems to fall silent, when the fire goes out and the cold of desolation dominates the horizon, it is at that very moment that the Creator begins to speak again. John sees the ashes moving slowly, as if breathing. Each particle of dust begins to come together, forming shapes, faces, memories. There is something sacred in this process. Rebirth does not happen with explosions of glory, but with the gentle breath of the Spirit. It is as if God touched the ashes and said, "I am still here." And what was dead responds. The dust transforms into flesh, the silence into song, the emptiness into promise. The same fire that once consumed now purifies. This is the divine law that modern man ignores, the cycle of restoration. The Eternal One discards nothing that was once touched by his presence. He gathers the ruins, gathers the fragments, and transforms them into testimonies. And what the world calls loss, he calls a process. John understands that for God, nothing is truly lost. Everything is prepared. The ashes are the womb of eternity. The revelation unfolds before the prophet's eyes. He sees mountains of ash rising, and from within them, rivers of light gush forth. A new creation begins to pulsate, not with the colors of the flesh, but with the essence of the Spirit. The old world gives way to an incorruptible reality, and the voices that once wept now sing hymns. Each soul that has passed through the fire carries in its eyes a gleam that time cannot extinguish, the gleam of one who has been purified by pain and restored by grace. Rebirth, however, is not an easy spectacle. Before the dawn comes the darkest night. Before restoration, the desert. Modern man wants immediate results, but God works with eternity. He allows silence, oblivion, and dust, not to destroy, but to transform. John understands that God's time is not counting, it is shaping. The human soul is forged between ashes and fire until the reflection of the Creator manifests itself again within it. And perhaps that's why so many people feel they are living through the end. Because the end is the most perfect disguise for a new beginning. God hides the seeds of tomorrow in the ruins. When something is uprooted, He is making room. When something is burned, He is purifying. When everything seems empty, He is preparing the ground for the new. John realizes that rebirth doesn't come as an escape, but as a revelation. What dies before God never disappears, it only changes form. The ashes which once wept now sing. The fire that destroyed becomes the same fire that illuminates. The throne of judgment is transformed into an altar of redemption. And God, who seemed distant, now dwells amidst the restored ruins. He does not merely observe, He participates. He is the craftsman who gathers the pieces and molds them into eternity. John sees the face of the Lamb, and his eyes, those eyes of fire, now shine with tenderness. The same fire that judged now warms. Love and justice cease to be opposites and become one. The modern world doesn't understand this. It fears the end, tries to avoid it, to hide from it. But the end is the instrument of grace. What God destroys, He destroys out of love, to save what can still be saved. John realizes there is a divine mathematics that man does not comprehend. The more something is reduced, the purer it becomes before the eternal. Gold is only gold after fire. Faith is only faith after trial, and love is only love when it survives the ashes. The prophet then sees the cities reborn, not of stone but of spirit. The new Jerusalem begins to take shape, not on the old land, but on the promise. What was burned and consumed becomes fertile ground. The earth itself sighs with relief, finally understood, finally redeemed. Time, which once corroded everything, now bows before eternity. The human clock falls silent, and all that remains is the sound of rebirth. This is the secret the world has ignored. Rebirth doesn't happen outside. It happens inside. It's not about rebuilding walls, but about rebuilding the soul. John understands that God doesn't just want to restore the planet, but to restore the human heart. Because a new heaven is useless if humanity remains the same. The ashes of creation cry out for a new consciousness, a being that lives in harmony with the sacred, with time, with truth. And perhaps you feel it now. That gentle call that touches the soul and says, "Rise from your ashes." It is God Himself reminding you that the fire that burned you was not meant to destroy you, but to reveal what was eternal within you. The losses, the pain, the falls, all of them are part of this divine refining process. No suffering is wasted when God is at the center. Rebirth is not a prize for the strong, but a gift for those who persevere. John understands that the secret is not to resist the fire, but to trust in it. Because God never burns what is essential, only what prevents the essential from shining, and so the man who surrenders is the same one who is reborn. The ashes, then, become the most powerful symbol of faith, the certainty that what has been reduced to nothing can still flourish. The scene widens. John sees a multitude rising from the ashes of the world. These are voices that once wept and now sing. These are souls that have understood the purpose of suffering. They do not ask for the past to return. They await the new that comes from God. The sky, which was once silent, now opens in chorus, and the sound that echoes is not the trumpets of judgment, but the song of restoration. Everything that seemed like an end is now a beginning. Everything that man called ruin, God calls root. The fire was not punishment, it was language. The dust was not oblivion, it was a promise. And the ashes, which the world despised, became the most faithful testimony of God's power to recreate from nothing. John understands that the entire universe breathes this cycle: birth, death, rebirth, and in each stage the eternal reveals himself with greater depth. And that is why, when the ashes speak, we must listen, because in them is the echo of love that never gives up. With each flame extinguished, God lights another. With each fall, He reveals a new face of His mercy. The ashes speak not of defeat, but of promise, of a God who transforms ruins into altars, despair into hope, and silence into song. If this message resonates with you, comment now. From the ashes, I am reborn. Write this sentence as an act of faith, as a spiritual seal, and if you want to go further, also say what you believe God will still restore in your life. I want to see who among us already feels the wind of rebirth blowing. Because that's what the ashes are saying. The end is over, and the new has begun. When all that we are is reduced to dust, when the body ceases to pulsate, and time devours us in silence, what will remain? This is the question that echoes at the end of all voices, the final whisper that crosses generations and centuries. When you are dust, what will your ashes say before God? Because dust is not the end. Dust is a witness. It holds the memory of gestures, intentions, hidden thoughts. Dust is the sacred archive of eternity, and when the eternal calls, even what has been forgotten will answer. Ashes do not lie. They reveal what man tried to hide. Each particle carries the truth of what we were and what we could have been. Before God, even what was erased on earth will cry out in heaven. Ashes speak, and when they speak, the entire universe falls silent to listen. Think about this. Your story doesn't end in the grave. Every choice you make, every word you utter to the wind, is being recorded in a language the modern world has forgotten, the language of the Spirit. Humanity lives as if nothing has eternal weight, as if the present moment were enough. But there is a divine accounting that is not lost in oblivion. And fire, that same fire that consumes and purifies, is God's scribe. It inscribes in the invisible everything that existence has touched. Burning is translation. It is passage. It is the soul returning to its point of origin, stripped of masks before the one who sees the invisible. John, in his vision, understands the mystery. He sees the ashes rising like silent prayers and understands that there is judgment even in what has been forgotten. Nothing is dead before the Creator. Even dust carries purpose. Humanity, blinded by haste and vanity, ignores that dust is the beginning and the return. We live as if there were no eternity, and therefore we waste the sacred. But the ashes, they bear witness. They wait, they hold the promise of a new dawn. When the wind blows over them, the invisible moves. Time seems suspended, and it's as if the voice of God himself were asking, "What remains of you when the fire extinguishes the form?" This question tears through the silence. There is no easy answer, because it's not about religion, nor doctrine, nor human symbols. It's about essence. It's about what we are when all appearances are gone. What remains when the gold melts, when the name disappears, when the eyes close? The ashes will answer, and not with words, but with memory. And that's why we need to think, what are we recording in them now? The modern world erases, distorts, masks. The digital records images, but the spiritual records intentions. God doesn't see pixels. He reads the invisible. He sees what's behind the action, what's in the secret of the heart. And that's what the fire reveals. That's why many fear judgment, because the fire doesn't just burn the body, it reveals what is pure and what is false. The dust of each of us is sacred, because in it rests the signature of the Creator. When God molded man, he touched the dust and breathed the Spirit. It was the encounter between the earthly and the eternal. And one day, that same breath will return to claim what was done with the gift of life. The cycle is perfect. Everything that begins in dust returns to dust, but transformed. Death is merely the disguise of transmutation. Fire does not destroy the righteous, it refines them. The ashes of the saints shine. The ashes of the arrogant are scattered in the wind of oblivion. That is why fire is language. It translates the invisible. It reveals justice and glory. And one day all the dust will rise before the throne, not to be judged by what it seemed to be, but by what it truly was. The truth from the ashes will be humanity's last sermon. There will be no defense, no explanation, only the echo of what we were before the gaze of God. Think about it. If ashes could speak now, what would they say about your life? Would they say you were light, or that you were shadow? Would they say you left marks of love or traces of pride? Write in the comments, "My ashes will speak of faith." I want to see who understands the spiritual dimension of this message. Because those who understand feel that it's not an ordinary video. It's a calling. It's a forgotten revelation. This is the kind of reflection that is no longer heard. The world lives rushing by, distracted, anesthetized. But there is something that God wants to restore, the awareness of eternity, the awakening from the dust, the understanding that nothing is lost. Everything is being counted, seen, and preserved. The ashes of each act have a voice, and that voice will rise when time runs out. Therefore, before continuing, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this truth, and comment below what the Spirit made you feel. Write in the comments a word that summarizes what touched your heart. It could be eternity, memory, fire, restoration. This is more than engagement, it's testimony. Because when you comment, you declare that you understood, that the dust speaks, that the ashes have life, that the invisible is real, And remember, it's not the end. There is still something that the Eternal One wants to reveal in the next words. What comes now is the point where the dust meets the promise, where what was burned is transformed into light. So comment, like, subscribe, and prepare your spirit, because the next part is the moment when the silence of the ashes transforms into a celestial voice.